exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series inside of VMware. That's right, we're coming back with more of the VMware Certified Professional version 6, and this is actually a part 2. Joining us back in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. Ready to dive right back into our vSphere 6 and our data store episode. In part 1, we started talking about data stores, right? Places that we can store our data. We can put our virtual machine disks and other things. We got a chance to see direct attached storage. We saw iSCSI storage. We talked about fiber channels. So we've kind of knocked those out. In this episode, I want to pick up with NFS. NFS is the Network File System, which is it's actually a Unix protocol. It was created years and years ago, back in the definitely by the 80s, maybe even in the 70s, for transferring files across the network. And it was designed for Unix to Unix systems. Well, ESXi is built on top of Linux. You've got a lot of SUSE Linux under the hood, and so it makes sense that it would have NFS support, and it certainly does. So when we create a data store, we can create a data store that's VMFS, right? And we saw that with our direct attached storage and fiber channel and even iSCSI. Or we can create one that's NFS. That's a network file share that's stored somewhere on the network, right? That we've got a Unix-based server somewhere in our network that's storing data, and we can connect up vSphere and ESXi to it and store some stuff. So it's just another option for data stores.
Don, you said one of the things that I remember you saying is that NFS is rarely used anymore. Is there a real-world implementation where we would use NFS, giving us a justification for it still being in the product?
Yeah. So in the last episode, when I was creating the VMFS stores, I said NFS is an option. I never use it, right? And what I probably should have said is not that I never use it, that I very rarely use it. The main reason is performance, right? NFS shares aren't going to be high speed. They're just over your regular TCP/IP network, so they're doing contention with other traffic. You've got TCP/IP overhead, and it's just not going to give you great performance. So if you're thinking about running your virtual machines from an NFS share, you're going to be disappointed. It's not going to be fast. But that doesn't mean they're useless. There's actually a couple of different examples where you might use them. For example, you might have a virtual machine template, right? A template is a virtual machine that you create but you don't run, that you clone over and over and over again. So let's say I need 100 web servers. I don't want to create 100 web servers individually. I can create one and turn it into a template. And now every time I need a web server, I can just clone the template, and now I've got a new web server. All right. The thing about a template is I'm not going to run it. So do I want to put it on my SSD or my really expensive SAN? No. I only need it every now and then, so I can put it on an NFS share and know that it's there and ready for me if I ever need it. So it's a great place to store templates. But the place that I really use it, ISO images, right? When you install an operating system or install third-party software, when you do updates, a lot of times you'll have a CD or a DVD image that you need to provide to the virtual machines. Now, you can give them access to the physical drive on the server, but if you're doing vMotion, if your VMs can bounce from server to server to server, it's kind of a pain to figure out which server they're on to go put the CD in the drive. And then if you're like me, you forget the CD in the drive, and now the virtual machine can't fail over to another host because it depends on that CD that's in the first one. So it's much better to do a software image of the CD, an ISO image, and store that in an NFS share. Then we can connect that as a data center into vCenter, into ESXi, and they'll be able to see it. And now when we install a virtual machine, they'll be able to have that access, and we'll even be able to fail over to other hosts because it's network storage. It's not a physical CD drive in a physical host. So that's really the example of where I use it the most is with those ISO images. So let's get one created. I've actually got an NFS share sitting here on my network that we're going to connect to and get it put in as a data center now, or a data store. If you watch the first episode, you know that we already created a couple of data stores. And so I can see the data stores that I made here on host 01. We have a direct attached storage data store that was hard drives right there in the server. And we have a iSCSI data store. What I'm going to do now is create another one that's going to be an NFS data store. So I'm going to go back over to my host, and I'll right-click on old ESX host 01. I'll go to storage, and I'll go to new data store just like we did before. The big difference is going to be right here on this screen. Instead of choosing VMFS, I'm going to choose NFS, right? I want to use the network file system to connect to a share on the network, right? Now it's going to ask me a question. Which NFS version do I want to support? NFS version 3 or NFS version 4.1? Now, pretty much everything supports NFS version 3, so you're pretty safe if you go with that one. But There are some scenarios where you definitely need NFS version 4.1. The main reason is authentication. You actually do have authentication with NFS version 3, but it's the older Unix style, and it's actually not the most secure thing in the world. There's a little bit of plain text exchange that happens, and so that's not ideal. With NFS 4.1, you get support for Kerberos authentication. And so now it's encrypted authentication that happens over the network. It's much more secure. VMware supports both, ESXi supports both, but it's up to your host, or wherever this NFS share actually resides, to configure it. And in my case, now that I think about it, this is probably something I should have checked before the show. I can't remember whether or not my NFS server supports Kerberos or not. So I'm going to go with NFS version 3 because I know it'll work. But in real life, if you can do NFS 4.1, you'll be better off from the authentication side. As far as speed and data access, that's all the same. There's not really anything too crazy there, but the authentication is what helps. All right. And I think, do you actually see, yeah, see how when I click, let me zoom in on this so we can see a little better here. When I click on NFS 3, I've only got 4 screens over here. But when I click on 4.1, there, configure Kerberos authentication. That's what it's adding. So if you ever forget what it is that it adds, you can see it right there on the screen. All right, but I'm going to do NFS 3, and I'll hit next. All right, now it kind of looks like the other data store stuff, except normally you'd pick a name here, and down here you'd pick a drive. Well, instead of picking a drive, it's asking me for a server and a folder, right? It's not asking for a username and a password. And so it's not asking for authentication. How's it authenticating? Well, when somebody sets up an NFS share like this, they can actually set up IP address filtering and limit the IP addresses they can get to it. And that's what I'm doing. So I actually don't need a username and a password. But if I had done NFS 4, I'd have a username and a password I can provide when I configure that authentication. All right, so I'm going to call this one. Now, what I've been calling them before was ESX-host01-NFS data store, something like that, so I could remember where it was attached. But here's the thing. With NFS, it's a network file system. I can attach it to more than one host. So I don't necessarily need to tie this to one host. I'm just going to call this my NFS data store because I can attach it to as many people as I want. I'm connecting it just to one right now. I'm connecting it to ESX host 01, but I can always come back and add it to more. Or I might just want to call this my ISO data store, right? It's NFS, but I'm going to be storing my ISO images here, so I might want to give it a name that I can remember.
Don, with the naming conventions there, are they arbitrary, or is this really just so that, you know, if you get hundreds of these, you can identify them? They don't have to be specifically set up like this. This is just for your easy identification of where they're located?
That's exactly right. You can call them whatever you want. You can call it Bob, right? So this is going to be my Bob data store, and then you can have Steve. And I've gone to places where they thought it was funny, and they did all the Simpsons characters. And so they're like, oh yeah, those virtual machines are over there on Bart or over on Homer. And it's funny until, you know, an emergency is going on and you got to find something, and all the data center stores, they have stupid names. You don't know what's where, and super frustrating. I've seen Simpsons characters, Roman gods, Greek gods, any gods, just tons of different Star Trek characters, captains. It's super annoying. Give it a name that makes sense and helps you find things.
So it's more for ease of access, so that'd be your advice. Naming conventions need to be easily identifiable and definitely recognizable really, really quick, especially in a DR situation.
Absolutely, yep. So if I give it a name like this, yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue, but my end users aren't going to see it. It's just for administrators. And when I look at it, I see NFS shared ISO data store. So what do I learn from that? It's a data store. I kind of already knew that. I could probably leave that off, right? But NFS, I know the protocol. It's shared. In other words, I got more than one host attached to it, and ISOs, I'm going to be storing ISOs there, right? So just come up with a naming convention that works for you, and know that you can rename these things after the fact. And you can be sure that I renamed Lisa and Maggie and Marge and all those to actual names. You know, with that, I didn't work for that company. I was doing a contract for them, and man, it was a nightmare. So I'm sure it seemed funny. It seemed like a good idea at the time, not in practice. All right, so now I need to specify the folder and the server. Now, unfortunately, the folder names are usually not very easy. You know, if you think of like Windows shares, you have the server / and whatever the folder name is. But in NFS, it actually publishes or it exports the whole Unix path name. And so I've got to provide the full path name to it. You'll have to go and get this from your server. So I'm going to do -/mnt/nfs/nfs storage /ISO. So this is going to be where my ISOs are stored, okay? And then I'll punch in my server, which is that guy right there, and we'll get connected, okay? Now, if you look down here at the bottom, it tells us mount NFS as read-only, okay? Do I want it to be read-only? Well, these are ISO images, and that's all I want there, right? VMware can't create ISO images, so I don't have to worry about it writing. Well, what I do have to worry about is somebody could create a virtual machine and they could choose this as the data store to use. And now there's a virtual machine hard drive running in it, and I don't want that. So I might want to mount it read-only to stop people from creating virtual machines or templates and sticking them in there. It's just going to be ISOs in there. I don't want other stuff, and so I can create it like that, and I can move forward. I can always create another NFS share if I want and make that one available for virtual machines or for templates or whatever, right? So in fact, I'll do that. I'll create a second one. So I'm going to finish this one. This is my ISO one, right? So I'll finish that. And let's say I want to create another data store, another NFS one, but this one I want it to be for virtual machine templates. So I'm going to come in here and create another one. So I'll go back to storage and new data store. I'll pick NFS again. I'll stick with NFS version 3 because my memory is terrible. And then this one, I'll call it my NFS shared VM data store, right? Or even VM template. So this is my VM template data store, right? Now people will know that's exactly what this is. It's NFS, so it's going to be slow. It's shared. More than one server has access. It's VM templates. That's what go here, and it's a data store. And so I can punch in where I want that one to be. So I will put it, it's on the same server. It's just a different folder. And I'll punch in that server also. Okay, so as soon as that's done, now this one I'm not going to mount read-only. I want people to be able to create and put things into it. And so I'll just hit next. And I'll finish that one up. And now that's going to get created in the background, and I'll have my 2 data stores in place. And as always, we need to wait just a little bit before they show up. NFS ones normally show up pretty quickly because we're not having to rescan a physical adapter. It's just on the network. And I can see here's my 2 NFS data stores that I just created. One's read-only, the other one's read-write. They're both NFS version 3. And if I scroll over here, they're both the exact same size because they're just different folders on the same drive, right? So I've kind of separated it that way on the NAS box. So now I've got 2 new data stores that are ready to rock. And when I create a virtual machine and I go to pick a destination, I could pick the direct attached storage or the data store one. I could pick the virtual machine template data store, and now I could throw data in there and it'll get stored right there in NFS. Okay, so the virtual machine one, that one's easy. If we want to see that in use, I create a virtual machine. Let me whip up one real quick. And as soon as I go to create that one and move forward, we'll start to see where we pick our destination. I just got to get forward to that screen. I'm just picking stuff really quick here to get to the storage screen. And when I get to the storage screen, here is where things get really tricky because it doesn't differentiate. You'll start to see where the confusion could be. I don't see the ISO storage. I don't see it because it's read-only. Can't create a VM in a read-only environment, right? So it doesn't show up. But I do see the VM template one. And had I not named it NFS-share-VM, if I hadn't named it that, it would look just like the other data stores. Okay? There's no real way to differentiate, and that's why, again, I say we need to name it that way. I do have the type over here where I see NFS version 3, but it's really easy to overlook that. The icons are the same. Everything just looks basically the same. All right? Now, as far as getting that created and putting it in place, that's great. But one of the advantages of NFS that I mentioned is that we can use it with more than one host, right? Now, be careful with that because you have the temptation that now I've added it to ESX host 01. I could go and right-click on host 2 and go to storage, and well, host 2 is offline, so that's not going to work out so well. But I could come in and do new data store and add it a second time. If you do that, VMware and ESX will see it as 2 different data stores, even though it's pointed to the same place. So if you want it connected to more than one, the better thing to do is to pull up your data store. So I'm going to ESX host 01, I'm going to related objects and data stores, and I'm going to find that NFS data store, like the ISO one or the VM template one. And if you right-click on it and look at the options, you'll see you have an option right here, mount data store to additional hosts. Okay? If you do that, it'll connect the NFS store to more than one host, and it'll recognize that it's the same data store. That it's not 5 different data stores on 5 different hosts. It's one data store on 5 different hosts. They all have direct access to it, and it's defined one time. So you always want to make sure you use that mount data store to additional hosts to add it. And if I were to do that right now, my host 02 is offline, so it's probably going to complain. But basically, it's going to give you a list of all your hosts right here, and you can check off the hosts that you want to add, and then you just hit OK. You don't have to provide the username and password again. You don't have to provide the path again. It's already got all that information. You just check off the host and hit OK, and it creates it. So it's trying to scan my second host right now. It's offline, so that's why it's kind of stalled there, and I can't choose it. But what I would normally do is check that off, or check off all the hosts, right? And then you just hit OK, and it adds them. And now they've all got direct access to it, and you're in business. So that's really the best way to handle the NFS storage, to get it visible across all your hosts.
Now, Don, what about the ISO share that you've created on that? Couple of things on that. For one, you flagged it as read-only, so now we can't write to it. So how does that affect your ability to put ISOs in it? And if we can, how do we do that?
Okay, so a couple of ways to do it. Now, if I want to put files in here, I showed you where if I create a virtual machine, I can pick the NFS storage and it'll put it there. But I can't create an ISO that way. It won't let me. So I've got to get the ISOs loaded into the NFS share somehow. And there's two ways to do it. There's the way I don't like to use, but I'm going to show you anyway. And then there's the way that I actually do use. So the way I don't like to use is right here inside of vSphere, is that you can click on that data store. So I can take like this VM template data store. And if I click on that, it's going to take me to the data store itself, or I'm going to get an error. Hang on, it's going to reload my UI. It's the convenience of a web-based UI. So I'm going to browse into the data store, though. I promise I will. And when you get in there, it's actually got an option that says files. And you can view the files in the data store. And you can upload files. Now, the reason I don't like it is it uses a little agent-type software that it has to have. So here we go. So now I'm back. And so I clicked on the data store. It took me to the data store. And up here, you can see virtual machines and host under related objects, but I want to go to manage. And under manage, you've got files. And under files, well, you can see the files. I can see what's in that data store. Mine's empty, right? And I can upload files and create folders. Okay. Now, the thing is, if we go to upload, look at that little note that pops up. It's probably hard to read, but it says, install client integration plugin, blah, blah, blah. It wants to install a web browser plugin, and that's what I don't like. This plugin that I'm going to use one time and not use again, I don't want to install it, so I don't normally go this route. And for my VM template folder, it's going to work out just fine. It's not going to work out fine for my ISO folder because the ISOs, like Wes pointed out, I made read-only. Okay, so if they're read-only, well, that's read-only for VMware, right? I can go outside of VMware. So like on my own laptop here, so I'm on my laptop, and let me just make this a little bit bigger for us so we'll be able to see it all. I'm on my laptop, and my laptop's a Mac, so it's Unix based, right? We've got BSD kind of buried under the hood with it, and I've got NFS support built in. Mac, Linux, Unix, they've all got NFS built in. Windows is the only one that doesn't, and you can get third-party NFS clients, and Microsoft actually has an NFS client they don't support very well. So all of them are capable of connecting to NFS shares one way or another. So what I can do is right here on my Mac, I can get connected and I can copy the ISOs in, and then they'll be available. So back here, if I go, let me go back to my ISO data store. So I'm going to find my ISO data store buried in here. And let's see if I can crash my UI again. So I'm going to go into the ISO data store. Here it is. And looking at it, I can see it's empty, right? There's no files in here. And so on my Mac, I'm going to copy some files in. And so the first thing I need to do is I need to make a directory for it. So I'm going to create a folder on my hard drive that I can mount to. And oh, I've done this before, so I've already got the folder. So all right. So now I just need to basically mount to it. So what I'm going to do is do a quick dash mount, and I'm going to tell it that I'm mounting to an NFS store. So I'll do a -t NFS. On a Unix box, I wouldn't have to do this if I was on Linux, for example. But on a Mac, I need to reserve the port. Macs do weird things with network ports, so I need to do a port reservation. And I'm going to tell it to do it read-write. So I'm going to create a read-write connection to that server. And so now I'm just going to put in the server and the path to that folder, and I know my head's going to get on top of this, but let me just punch that in. And it's going to word wrap on me here, but basically I'm pointing to that server and the folder, and I'm going to mount that to this folder on my hard drive like that. Okay, so now on my hard drive, I've got this folder that, you know, let me elevate my privileges here real quick. I'm bumping into permission issues. There we go. All right, so now I'm in that folder where I just mounted to, and I'm connected to that NFS share. Now I can just copy files right into here, and they'll be in the NFS share. So if I go to, let's see, I think I've got some Actually, I think I've got an external hard drive attached that has what I want. Yeah. There we go. I always keep a handful of ISOs available for operating systems that I want to install. So if I want to do something like, actually, you know what? I want a minimal install is what I want. So let me get, oh, if I can spell my own name right, I guess that's going to help us a little bit. There we go. I want to copy this CentOS minimal install. I'm going to copy that into the NFS share, right? So I'm copying it, and what's going on now is my Mac is copying it over the network and into that NFS share. And it's going to copy it over, and once it's in the NFS share, I can go back to VMware and refresh the screen, and it'll show up. It's read-only in VMware, but on my Mac, it's read-write. And I can copy the stuff because I knew how to get into it and get it mounted, and I'm on the authorized list to connect. So there we go. It's connecting over. Now, again, because I'm on a Mac, it's trying to do this extended attribute garbage, so I can ignore that. That wouldn't happen on a Linux box or on a Windows box. That's a Mac thing. But now I could go and start to copy other disks, maybe the ones that are a little bit larger. That was a short one. I wanted to copy a fast one here so we can get it done in a reasonable amount of time. But maybe I want to have a full version of CentOS or Windows Server 2012, for example. I might want to copy that one. So I'm going to copy Windows Server 2012, and I'm going to copy that to /private/NFS, and I'll get that one copying too. That's going to take a little while. And so while we're waiting on that, I'm going to jump back here, and that data store still shows as empty, but you'll see I've got a little refresh button parked over here, and I can refresh it, and there we go. I see that CentOS image that I copied over, and I see the Windows Server images copying over right now. So now these ISOs are available. And if I've mounted this NFS share to more than one host, all of my hosts now have access to these CDs. And so when I have a virtual machine, which I don't think I have any virtual machines right now, but when I create a new virtual machine, let's say I want to create a web server, so I can come in here and create a new virtual machine, and I'll just call it Web01 or something like that, nothing too creative. So I'm going to create Web01, and it's going to ask where to put it. I'll put it on ESX host 01. And then for my storage, I'm going to mount that into my direct attached data store. We'll have it local because that'll be faster. For compatibility, I'll do ESXi6. For my guest OS, this one is going to be Linux. We're going to do CentOS. I think that was that CentOS 7 or 6? Oh, it doesn't matter. They all grouped together here anyway. As soon as I find CentOS in the list, there it went. Whoops. Apparently the hard part for me is going to be navigating this drop-down box. There it goes. I need CentOS 4567 64-bit. Perfect. So I'm going to pick that one, and eventually I'll get to hardware. Here we go. On the hardware, if I want to install an operating system, it's got to get the operating system from somewhere, so I need to put that CD in. So I'm going to come in here and choose a data store ISO file, and when I do that, it's going to let me browse my data stores, and I can pick that ISO data store, and it's going to show the CDs, and I can pick that CentOS disk, and I can say okay, and it's going to pop that disk in there, and I'm going to check to connect it because I need to boot off of it. I need it to be connected. But now I've got a central place. I didn't have to go put a CD in a server. I didn't have to copy the ISO image to this host. I might have 1,000 hosts. If you have 1,000 hosts, you don't want 1,000 copies of that CentOS disk. Now I have one copy of the CentOS disk in a network share, or the Windows disk, or whatever, and they can all be accessed right from here. And now, when I fire this machine up the first time, it's going to boot up, and it's going to have access to that CD and be able to start the install. And you know, I think I gave it too much memory. Hang on, I'm going to run my system out of memory if I'm not careful. So let me lower that memory a bit. I've got a lot of different virtual machines running on my laptop here, so we definitely run the risk of exceeding what's available. So there we go. That'll be a little better. And now I can power this thing on, and when I power it on, it is going to connect up to that NFS store. It's going to mount that ISO image, and it's going to boot it up. So I'm going to give that just a moment while it powers on. There it goes. And then I'm going to connect to the console as soon as I find the Open Console option. And here it goes. So it's booting up, and there it goes, booting the CentOS installer. And so now we can get right in here, and we can install or upgrade, and I'm running off that data store. So nice central place to have those ISO images.
That's awesome. Once you've got it set up, a lot more convenient, I could say, for sure. Now, one of the things I've noticed on is, An interface is dynamic, but it certainly isn't automatic. You have to do the refresh button, hit that refresh button a lot. Is there a way that you can make that a little bit more simplistic or easier?
Yeah, it's kind of frustrating. You're constantly having to refresh. Anytime you add an adapter, anytime you add drives, anytime you add a data store, anytime you add files to the data store, you're constantly having to refresh. There is a way we can try and make that a little bit easier, and it does show up on the exam. We have these things called storage filters that are built into vCenter, and I'm going to be honest with you guys, you're never going to use storage filters in real life. The refresh is inconvenient, but you just do it and it's done. It's not that big of a deal. But there's storage filters we can modify that change the way that storage is handled by vCenter. It's hard to do these filters, but there is a filter we can put in place that says anytime a management change happens, automatically refresh storage. What that's going to do is it's going to make it where every time you make a change, it automatically refreshes, which creates a little bit of a performance hit. And most of the time, you're not making storage changes. So it's kind of wasteful, but it can make it automatic, and it does turn up on the exam for whatever reason. So it's one of those things that I tell you, you're never going to use it in real life. The one time you use it will be on the exam to get the question right. So we definitely need to know. But let me show you those storage filters, and then we'll kind of wrap up from there. In the vSphere web client, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our vCenter server. So let me switch back over to host and clusters and go to my vCenter server. I'm not choosing a host, I'm choosing the vCenter server itself. So for me, that's this WinServer 01 that I'm running vCenter on. You're going to choose that, and you're going to go over here to Manage. And under Managed, you're going to go to Advanced Settings. All right? We've messed with a lot of these settings, but never Advanced Settings. What Advanced Settings does is it shows you every setting for the system, even ones that don't have a GUI element. There's some things you can configure that just aren't in the graphical interface, and they're all right here. So what you're seeing are they're kind of like registry key entries in Windows, is we're seeing all these possible things that we can go in and manually edit. Well, if you think this is advanced, there's even more options that don't even show up here. So these are like the advanced options. If I want the storage to automatically refresh every time I make a management change, well, I can create an advanced option, and that's not the official term, I'm going to coin that one. But we can create an advanced option in here that says manually do that refresh, and it's called a filter. It's not actually filtering anything out, but the original use for it was to filter. You could actually hide certain things. So for example, if I go to edit this, when you edit, you'll see all the existing filters, and you can add in your own. And when you add in your own, there's a couple that show up on the exam. Let me just kind of run through them. config.vpxd.filter.vms filter, that guy right there. Okay, if you type that in and you set the value to true, right? It's true or false, either on or off. If I set it to true, what that's going to do is it's going to hide, oh, it should be VMFS filter. There we go. It's going to hide VMFS stores. I won't see my VMFS data stores anymore. Okay, I would see NFS, but I wouldn't see VMFS. Now, what's the value in that? There really isn't. I can't think of a value for it, but we need to know that it exists. So that's an example of how these filters kind of work. And it's not the only one. We could do an RDM filter, and that would hide the raw devices. If you ever had a virtual machine that had a raw hard drive attached to it, we could hide those. If you're not going to use that feature, you can just hide it, and now it won't show up. That's one you might actually use if you're trying to actively stop people from using that. We can do, oh, this is interesting. The same host and transports filter. If we turn that filter on, if there is any incompatibility with the storage at all, it hides it. If it's a unsupported storage adapter, an unsupported hard drive, if the configuration has been changed in a way to make it unsupported, it hides it. This is a great way to ensure that people only do configurations that VMware can help with. Because there's nothing worse than calling VMware on the phone, you've got an active support contract, and they tell you, oh, we're sorry, you configured this in a way that's not supported, we can't help you. To pay all that money and then not get support. So we could turn this on, and that'll basically hide anything that's not compatible. So if we do something by accident, we'll see it disappear. I think it's kind of annoying, but you can do it. All right, but the one that I really want to highlight, the one that is actually useful, is config.vpxd.filter.host rescan filter, like that. The host rescan filter, if we set that to true, now anytime we make a management change on our storage, our data stores, or whatever, it's going to do a rescan. So this is going to cause it to rescan automatically. This will do everything except for new files in an NFS store. when new files are created in NFS store, VMware has no way to know that happened. There's no trigger event. Like, because I uploaded those files from my Mac. How does it know that happened? It doesn't know, right? So there's no way for it to know, and so there's no way to trigger it. But for everything else, if I go and rename a data store, if I go in and add an adapter, if I go in and do anything like that, it'll automatically do the rescan for me. I was probably going to rescan anyway. This makes it a little bit easier and automated. So these filters are not easy to use, right? I mean, first off, you got to remember it. You're not going to remember that. So you got to go and Google it. You got to find the value. You got to put it in here. You set it to true, and now it's in place. Fortunately, it is set on the vCenter server, so it kind of applies to all the different hosts that you have, but it is something you have to remember to do. Personally, I just remember to hit refresh, but that's partly because I don't work for just one company. If I go to multiple companies, I don't know if they've got this set or not. And so I'm in the habit of always hitting refresh, right? But if you are the VM administrator for your company and you just support one environment and you want to set this and make it easier, you certainly can. Just know that anytime you hire somebody new, you've got to tell them you made that change. You've changed that default behavior. So it's not something I'm a big fan of, but it does turn up on the exam.
A lot of great information, Don, on the data stores. We appreciate that. Looking at the time, though, it does look like we're coming to the end of another episode. But before we do you have any additional information on setting up your data stores inside of vSphere?
The main thing to be aware of on these things is performance, right? Not all data stores are created equal. That a VMFS data store, for the most part, is going to perform better than an NFS store. That a fiber channel or direct attach store is going to perform better than iSCSI. Direct attach normally gets you the best performance, but with fiber channel you can have more drives, which might actually get you a higher read I/O. We're going to talk in another episode about storage I/O control. If you watch the network episode, we had network I/O control, or NIOC. Storage has that too, SIOC. Those are advanced settings on the data store, but they apply to all of them, so I didn't cover it here. We'll cover it in another episode. So there are some advanced features that we'll get to that are actually useful, but what we've seen here are really the basics needed to create direct attached data stores, fiber channel data stores, iSCSI data stores, and NFS data stores. 4 different data store types that can be created here. The only other type we haven't talked about are the distributed data stores, the ones that are used in clustering, and we'll see those in the clustering episode.
Well, Don, as always, it's a pleasure to have you in the studios with us, and it's a pleasure to have you, the viewers, watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.